Give us the update. What's new? We know what happened last night, indicative of the whole season. So, and right now we are in 30th place in the power rankings. So, take it from there.
Okay, that's it. The end. When we had decided that the organization had to undertake a rebuild a couple of years back, and the rebuild had to happen after Mr. Illich's passing, there wasn't any way that organization was going to be able to sustain with a high payroll that was not working with a mid-market club. So we knew that the rebuild was going to have to happen. And as we've talked through what's happened over the past couple of years, I mean, you come to realize that when an organization makes a decision to rebuild, the rebuild is going to involve losing a lot of games. But once you enter into that stage of losing a lot of games, it's very, very painful. Now, I use the word painful in a relative term because in the big scheme of things, we know that there are people in life who have real life pain and real life suffering. And I certainly wouldn't equate that to this, but when you're in a business to win, and we had been accustomed to winning for a good number of years, and then you find yourself in the throes of a lot of losing, it's tough to watch. It's tough to stomach because that's not the end game. And while you may have a projection of when you think this is going to turn around, there's no guarantees that in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, the rebuild will start to bear fruit. Our farm system has gotten a lot better over the last few years. However, it still is difficult to project when this gets turned around. And so in the meantime, we're going through an extremely difficult season, one that is worse than what we had anticipated. But what happened early on in the season, we lost 4 starting pitchers, and 2 of our top pitching prospects at AAA Toledo went down with injuries. And when you lose, really in effect, 6 starting pitchers, that's real hard to overcome.
Yeah.
And you couple that with the fact that we're very offensively challenged. And a lot of players don't have the opportunity really to settle into anything. It's unrealistic to think that you can bounce players back and forth almost on an everyday basis and expect that you're going to be able to develop some continuity, some chemistry. Of course, when you're not winning, chemistry can be very difficult to develop. There's always been a lot of debate about what comes first, winning or chemistry. So we find ourselves, I think Al Avila had appropriately coined the phrase, we're in the deepest part of the valley right now. And we'll get through this year, but hopefully this rebuild isn't going to take 3, 4, 5 years. But again, there's no guarantee on a timeline on when this does get turned around. So there is talent that is emerging, not quite ready yet to play at the major league level. maybe even another year of development at AAA or AA. So I'm sure that the mindset among everybody right now is we'll do whatever we have to do to avoid having a 2020 like we're having this year. But again, you can't control the health factor. And nobody would have thought we were going to lose 4 starting pitchers with the big league team, and then 2 of our better pitching prospects in Toledo. That's just not something you can anticipate, and when that happens, it's even more difficult to overcome.
Who are the 2 prospects in Toledo? Just for us.
The 2 that I'm referring to are Bo Burrows and Kyle Funkhauser. But Funkhauser, he's had his struggles this year, and we ended up moving him back to Erie. Burrows was hurt for a while, but he is pitching again in Toledo and trying to get himself back on track. So those were the 2 pitchers that I was referring to at Toledo, because that's where they had started out this year. And of course, that group of young pitchers also doesn't include who I'm referring to with Casey Mize and Matt Manning and Alex Faedo. That group of 5 realistically is our top 5 pitching prospects. And it's not difficult to anticipate that at some point in time, certainly not 2020, but those 5 guys could represent our starting rotation. But again, a lot of things have to happen for that to fall in place, including everybody staying healthy, which we've had our share of injuries this year, and that's been the death knell for us.
Talk about it. Within the organization, there was a Monday, I believe, where the Tigers were off, Detroit Tigers, and they all came to Erie, the brass, to watch Casey Mize pitch a game. Talk about a debut or an opportunity to showcase before the brass that the game in Erie where Casey pitched.
Yeah, he's had an incredible start to his career, although his last outing wasn't very good, but he has been overcoming some shoulder inflammation. But he threw a no-hitter in his AA debut, and he's the real deal. And even though he's had a little bit of a setback, I think everybody to a man expects Casey to be a number 1 or a number 2 starter for the big league team, and he's just a quality individual. He's the kind of guy that you really enjoy having in your system, that you want to build around, because he brings everything to the table, not just his pitching ability, but the kind of man, the kind of person that he is.
He's pitched a no-hitter. There's Avila, there's Leland, there's whoever else, but there was they were all there. Within the organization, did you kind of raise an eyebrow saying, wow, what a showcase?
No question. I wasn't there when he threw the no-hitter, but when you think about it, not only did he throw a no-hitter, he threw it in his AA debut, and he threw it in front of the Tigers brass, and that kind of performance obviously will leave a very lasting impression. However, after that happened, all of a sudden, people are starting to chime in, not people from within the Tigers organization, but media, fans. Oh, we got to get Casey here. When is he going to come to Detroit? And people have to remember, just because he threw a no-hitter in his AA debut doesn't mean you're going to accelerate his development and his movement. You have to let that happen as it will. I think it would have been irresponsible if the Tigers would have moved Casey to Detroit after he threw the no-hitter. He's not ready yet. And even though the staff that we have in Detroit has been struggling a lot, it would be very short-sighted to bring any one of those young kids up ahead of when they'll be ready. And of course, as it's turned out, Casey has shown that he's not ready, I mean, he had a setback with the shoulder inflammation, and he's working back to get his command and his control more tuned. So he wasn't ready. None of the young kids are ready. But that was a challenge, I think, for not so much in the sense that do we or don't we, but there was a lot of pressure, I think, on Al to move him quickly, and perhaps even from ownership. I really don't know if Al received any ownership pressure to move Casey, but it was a stark reminder that you have to keep things in check. You got to pull the reins back. Can't get overly excited. This is a great thing to see. He's the real deal, but not yet.
I'm looking at the top 10 American League prospects. This would have been last year for the Tigers. And just for the heck of it, if you could give us a vignette, some I haven't heard about. Number 1 at that time was Franklin Perez. Did we still have him?
We do. He came to the Tigers in the Verlander trade, and we have not been able to keep him healthy. He's not pitching right now. He didn't pitch last year. He hasn't had any structural damage to the shoulder or the elbow, but he's dealing with some sort of an impingement syndrome right now that's preventing him from pitching, and he won't pitch this year. So we hope that he'll be able to pitch next year. But when you've gone a couple of years and a guy hasn't been able to stay healthy, all of a sudden it starts to make you wonder, what have we got here?
Yeah. Number 2 was Alex Fado, who's in Erie.
He's coming along well. He's developing well. I mean, again, he's another guy. Next year, probably anticipate being in Toledo, and we'll see where we go from there.
Number 3 is Matt Manning.
Same situation.
We talked about number 4, which is Bo Burrows. Number 5 was Jake Rogers,
who is catching in Toledo. Also a kid that we acquired from Houston in the Verlander deal, who came to us as a guy who was probably major league ready as a defensive catcher, but there were a lot of concerns about his game offensively, and he started off, did really well in Erie this year. So we moved him in Toledo, got off to a great start in Toledo. He's kind of tailed off somewhat offensively, but still is held in very high regard as a future big league catcher. His offense is going to determine whether or not he becomes an everyday catcher or a backup.
Number 6 was Daz Cameron.
Daz is in AAA right now, playing in the outfield. He's had some struggles offensively. Defensively, another guy who could play in the big leagues right now, but the bat's going to have to come along before he's able to position himself to be an everyday guy in Detroit.
Number 7 was Isaac Paredes.
Paredes, yep. He's in AA, and he played in the Futures game this year, and he's coming along well. I think next year he'll be in AAA unless something else happens before he gets a shot.
Number 8 is Dawel Lugo.
He's been up and down. Hasn't yet panned out to be the player that we thought he was or thought he could be, and he's bounced up and down between Detroit and Toledo. He's in Toledo right now, so the jury is still out.
Number 9 is Kristen Stewart, who's with the big league, right?
Big league team. He's got a lot of pop in the bat. Hasn't hit for average, striking out a little bit too much. Defensively, he's worked very hard on his game, and his first full season in the big leagues this year, and he's a very hard worker, quality guy, and I think if he continues to work hard, I think he's got a chance to be an everyday player for a long while.
And number 10 on that list of Baseball America, Greg Soto. Wasn't he up for a few?
Yeah, he's been up and down, and another guy we're trying to figure out where he fits. He's a left-handed pitcher, and he hasn't hasn't sustained as well as we have liked, but he has bounced up and down, and again, that doesn't always work in the player's best interest either. But another guy that he's on the 40-man roster, a guy that we think it can help us in the long run.
Of that top 10 there, who wasn't on that top 10? It's sort of been a surprise. The guy in the system that said, wow, we didn't see him coming.
Well, I mean, the one guy right now, when people ask, is there a guy that hasn't been high on everybody's radar who could be, and it's a young left-handed pitcher, Tarek Skubal, who is now at Double-A, and he hasn't been there very long. He's had 3 starts, and in 3 starts, he's got a 0.5 ERA. He's walked 4, struck out 34, and he's opened up a lot of eyes. I mean, now another guy you could get excited about quite easily, but you have to be mindful of the developmental process. So he's a guy who is rising fairly quickly in the eyes of a lot of our people in the organization.
So we come to the trade deadline. We usually were worried about getting the right person to hit the right mix that would propel us into the World Series. That was the conversation. That's all we remember. You flash back, look on the old YouTube, you can see that. In this case, I was reading the Detroit news, and really it boils down to Castellanos, Boyd, who pitched well last night, and Shane Green. Any sense from in your world?
When you're in the position that we're in, obviously you're going to be a seller. There's no question that you're going to be a seller. Mm-hmm. The challenge for Al and David Chad, when other contending clubs know that you're a seller and they've got assets that you want, they're going to try to get those guys giving up as little as possible. Meanwhile, Al is going to put a very high price tag on moving those players. So, on the one hand, we can say, sure, we're sellers, we want to be active, there are pieces that we want to move, but you can't move guys just for the sake of moving players. And unless Al can get in return what he deems fair value for those guys, it doesn't make any sense to trade guys. I think we'll be active. I don't know to what degree. Boyd is the guy for me that presents a bigger challenge, because this is a guy who you have control over for the next, I think, 3 years. Left-handed pitcher. He's a quality left-handed pitcher. He's an even better human being. He's the kind of guy that you want to be able to have on your staff to build around. But our club is so offensively deficient. I think Al's position is, if he moves Boyd or if he moves Green, he's looking to get some offense in return, not necessarily other pitching prospects, because we're starting to develop a fair number of pitching prospects. But the $64,000 issue for Al is, what are we going to get in return? And that's where he really has his work cut out for him. And,
Dan, Castellanos has to go.
I would think so.
Because he's going at the end of the season as a free agent.
Correct.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when you're moving a guy like Castellanos, because whomever gets him, in essence, is just getting a player for the balance of the season, obviously you don't have a lot of leverage in terms of what you can get in return. So could Al get a decent pitching piece out of that, or a decent position player? We'll see, but I'm with you. I mean, I don't know how Castellanos is here past the trading deadline. I really don't.
Danny, when we look at the Major League rosters over the last few years, it's somewhere around 80 to 85% are offshore ball players. How well does Detroit scout offshore Do they do it with their own people, or is there an organization of scouts offshore? And how many players on the Detroit roster are completely through your farm system? And is that true in the major leagues with all the other teams? There's more or fewer players coming directly from their entry point into their farm system to the major leagues?
From an international standpoint, we've invested heavily in international scouting, and we do it all on our own. There's been somewhat of a challenge because of all the strife in Venezuela, and we've really had to scale down our academy operations in Venezuela, and consequently we're sending a lot of the kids that we get in Venezuela over to the Dominican Republic. But we've invested a lot of money in international operations. We have scouts that are on the Pacific Rim as well, but the talent really, foreign talent is going to come from Latin America. I don't have the exact number of how many players on the roster right now.
Is it just 1, 2, 3, or is it
No,
23?
homegrown. There's more than that. I don't have the exact number of players who have come from our own system versus outside the organization, but the climate of the game today is such that, and I'll use the Yankees as really a good example. The Yankees in Houston. When the Yankees had injuries to Judge and to Stanton, there was at one point, 12 guys on the disabled list? And what did they do? It was amazing what they did. And it wasn't because they were the Yankees and they had money, it was because they had talent within that can help the Major League club. That's the whole purpose of developing your own talent, so that when you have guys that you lose with your Major League club, that you can fill in with young talent. Houston, they went through the same thing, obviously, that we're going through. They had three consecutive seasons of 100-loss seasons. And everybody was saying, look at what Houston is doing. That's not going to work. They're terrible, this and that. And now they are a perennial contender. They've done it the right way. And so they kind of set the model. Tampa Bay, every year they seem to do well because they scout and they develop well. They don't have the money to spend on expensive free agents, so they have to be able to develop. So we've had to take basically the same position when Mr. I was alive. It wasn't about scouting and development. It was about getting the best players we could get through free agency to win at the Major League level. And while that plan worked for us at the Major League level, even though we didn't get to win a World Series, we went to 2, but we didn't win, there was a price to pay. And that price was in scouting and player development, because they've ended up having to move a lot of young pieces during those times to trade, and we were always drafting low. But ultimately, if you're going to do it right, you have to do it this way. You have to have a payroll that's consistent with your marketplace, and you have to have a program that will flourish in scouting and player development. And I believe we're headed in the right direction, but the problem is, how long does it take to get back to where you want to be?
Dan, I noticed we've stayed away from the Asian players more so than many of the teams. Is it because they are so expensive?
I'd say that's a safe bet, but again, when it comes back to the scouting and development component in the foreign market, it's going to be Latin America. Any of those players that come over from the Pacific Rim can be very expensive, and we're just not there yet. And that's not to say we won't be, but we're not there yet.
Would it ever come that Major League Baseball would have a ruling that 50%, 75%, 80% of the Major League roster has to be homegrown?
I don't think that'll ever happen, but I think what will eventually happen is an international draft. There isn't one right now, so basically it's one for all and all for one, and I think it does create an imbalance in the marketplace, and I believe there would have been an international draft 3, 4, 5 years ago, but it's a very, very difficult plan to put together. There are a lot of mitigating circumstances, and I mean, I'm not in the room when the lawyers for Major League Baseball are negotiating with the players union. I know it's not an easy task to complete, but I do suspect that within a year to 2 years that there will be an international draft, and I think that will serve the industry much better than the marketplace that we have now.
Speaking of marketplace, and unrelated to the Tigers for a second, you're being in Lakeland, Florida. There are 2 Major League franchises in Florida. Their attendance is, being kind, is woeful. And there's some conversation, at least among the writers, about split season. Part in Florida, maybe part in even Montreal. Is that just a pipe dream of some sports writers?
No, in fact, the commissioner has wholly supported the concept of Tampa Bay splitting a season between Tampa and Montreal. Now, from a personal perspective, that gets me very excited because Montreal holds such a special place in my heart for baseball, and I would love to see Montreal get a return to baseball. But the logistics involving splitting a major league season between 2 cities is seems to be a pretty daunting exercise. I mean, I know the first thing I think of is, what do you do with all the employees? You have employees who are working for a club in Tampa. They're going to play there April, May, June. Then the team moves to Montreal potentially. What happens to all the employees who are working in Tampa, can't go to Montreal to work, and vice versa? What happens if the team gets in the playoffs? Where do they play the games during the playoffs? I mean, those are only things that appear on the surface, and there's a lot more than that to have to work through that kind of a concept. I don't know if it'll come to a reality. I think that unless Tampa gets a new stadium, either they'll have to vacate the market or something like this will happen, because they can't continue to play a full season in Tampa given the constraints that they have right now, the financial constraints. So I was pretty excited when I saw that. Would I love to see Montreal get baseball on its own one day? Absolutely, I would. And I think they've shown that a decision to bring baseball back to Montreal would be well received there. Time will tell, but sure, I don't think anybody saw that one coming. I know when that announcement came out, I was like, whoa, wait a minute, how are you going to do that? But I guess if you're going to be innovative and you're going to think outside the box, that's a good place to start.